Welcome to another attempt at filling out the application. In other words, expanding our ability to apply the words of Scripture to our lives. I'm your host Larry, and today we will be looking for connection points in Acts chapter 14. The old song The Gambler by Kenny Rogers had a line that said, "You need to know when to walk away and when to run." That particular type of wisdom seems to be a big part of the ministry of Paul and Barnabas throughout the book of Acts, and particularly in chapter 14. The chapter begins with them in Iconium, where their ministry has been fruitful among both Jews and Gentiles. It also managed to stir up opposition among both groups, and apparently created a strange unity between them as they formulated a plan to abuse and even stone Paul and Barnabas. The NIV translates it simply that the two found out about the plan and fled. Flee is a great Greek word, katafugo. Think of how to pronounce it as a pet sitter telling someone going on vacation, "I'll watch the cat if you go." Paul and Barnabas didn't stick around to face the suffering. They katafugoed to Lystra and Derbe. It's kind of good to know that service to the Lord doesn't necessarily mean that we have to face whatever someone might want to dish out if they don't care for our faith. Sometimes God might lead us to stand up to a challenge, but sometimes we have to katafugo out of there. And like Kenny Rogers taught us, sometimes you walk away and sometimes you run. I guess the bottom line is that we want to live prayerfully and learn to find God's guidance as we move forward in our journey of discipleship. It's only a few verses later in Lystra that Paul seeks a man who was crippled from birth, and as he looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed. That's a pretty high level of spiritual discernment, but it just shows the prayerful connection to the Lord that was a part of Paul's discipleship. Through this prayerful connection, Paul could call out for the man to stand up and walk by the power of God. I don't know that we could all ever expect to be as in touch with the Spirit as Paul, but we should hope to keep learning and growing to find our spiritual best. It's just a few verses later that we're told some opposition arrived from Antioch and Iconium and created such an uproar that the now angry crowd pelted Paul with rocks, dragged him outside of the city, and left him there because they thought he was dead. He didn't katafugo fast enough here and wound up looking like something the cat drug in, though that's not a Greek word. When the other disciples gathered around him, he picked his battered and bruised self up and headed back into the city. The next day, though, he and Barnabas katafugoed out of there. They kept traveling and making disciples, all of whom were encouraged by Paul and Barnabas to remain true to the faith, even though they would have to go through hardships. Our two missionaries couldn't stay to lead, but they could appoint leaders for each church. And those leaders, we're told in verse 23, were committed to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. Our faith heroes knew that they couldn't stay with every believer to help them through the challenges to come, but they knew that the Lord most definitely would. As for Paul and Barnabas, the chapter ends with them going back to the church that had sent them forth, Antioch, where they brought a report not of what they had done, but of what God had done through them. That's enough for this week. Let's go be active disciples who don't just read the Word, but live the Word.